Muito bom dia a todos. Sou Mauri Oliva, diretor de Sustentabilidade, Cidadania Financeira, Relações com o Consumidor e Autorregulação da Federação Brasileira de Bancos. Sejam muito bem-vindos ao webinar
of FEBRABAN. Welcome to the webinar Towards a Greener Bank System, Brazil's Case, an event developed by FEBRABAN, the Central Bank of Brazil, and BIS, Bank for International Settlement. To start our webinar, I'd like to invite Mr. Sidney, President of FEBRABAN. He started his career in the financial system at Banco do Brasil. In 1990, he worked for 18 years at the Central Bank in several positions. He was also the Director of Institutional Relations and Citizenship. In May 2019, he took over the executive presidency of FEBRABAN, and since March 2020, he is the president. Amaury, thank you very much. I want to wish a good day and good morning to all of you who are with us. FEBRABAN, the Brazilian Federation of Banks, is very helped to promote this live with a very suggestive subject. On one hand, we are going to talk about towards a greener system, but also touching on the Brazilian experience. I'd like to thank the Director Fernanda Nechio, responsible for international affairs and corporate risks. I'd like also to greet and thank my colleagues, Luiz Pereira, and for the partnership of the BIS and Central Bank. And I'm honored to share this event with the former president of FEBRABAN, Murilo Portugal, who for 9 years led FEBRABAN, and also Denise Pavarina for sharing with us her valuable experiences in this webinar. What are we going to debate and share? Especially the role of the bank system in the development of a more resilient economy. This from the perspective of the Brazilian experience, both in the regulatory point of view as well as with the voluntary commitment that for a long time the bank sector has taken so we can have an economy based on sustainable actions. The pandemic showed us how vulnerable we have been and we are to natural factors, and make it even more clear that we should have positive attitudes in relation to nature and the environment. This is not a new proposal of the bank and financial system. It is concern. The sector has always been aware of sustainable development, and now we have a great opportunity to advance more rapidly, both in the social environmental risk management and also in the promotion of opportunities both to the clients and market, more aligned with the international context. There is no doubt that the SG aspects impact directly the financial flow and performance of the companies, and this makes the moment even more challenging. Banks finance the major productive chains of the country, and they need to foster actions to develop a more sustainable economy. I'd like to make a few comments of the bank sector in the sustainability area. In 2014, I was still in the Central Bank. I was the General Attorney, and I followed closely the actions of an innovative initiative that determined that all financial institutions should elaborate, implement, implement and disclose their policies on social environmental policies. It was a very important landmark, and it differentiated the sector. So it's important to have this determination that regulated entities to disclose their policies. In 2014, Murilo was leading the presidency. The sector complemented this effort, and FEBRABAN published in 2014 a standard on social environmental policy. So both were in the right path. This SG agenda evolved considerably, and the banks reviewed their policies. And more than that, the international regulation improved over these years. If we look to the regulations on climate change, we also had a relevant action, and in addition, the network of central banks was created for a banker bank system, and the central bank is part of it. And last year, it was launched the principles for accountability. This year, well aligned with the new agenda of Banco Central #sustainabilidade, we are improving the standard for the social environmental regulation to incorporate relevant subjects, including the SG and climate aspects, incorporating this, the core business to the sector. 5 years ago, approximately, FEBRABAN sought to develop a very relevant work to measure the results of the financing per economic activity, so we can identify the financing for the green economy and those who have more exposure to climate changes. Also, recently, the central bank gave us a great support to better measure these balances of these economic fundings, and gave access to a credit system, so we now can encompass all banks. So the sector and every individual bank can analyze their credit portfolio under the lens of the social environmental view. Another relevant fact, when we look to the balance of the credit portfolio of the banks in December 2019, 22% of this balance, credit balance to the companies, were directed to sectors that contribute directly to the so-called green economy. They are very significant when we talk about this credit portfolio, and so we can increase even more this green wallet or portfolio and reduce the exposure to risks. The sector is well mobilized. I'd like to mention some examples. In 2020, we had the first issue of a green bond by a private bank in Brazil, and we created green programs offering less interest rates or lower interest rates that are funding when you comply with some environmental points, and the banks have incorporated in their portfolio integrated. Another example is the plan for the Amazon that was announced by the 3 largest private banks in Brazil, and they created a consultative board that will work to build a model to track the links of the productive chains in Brazil, especially those more involved with this theme. For instance, agribusiness. The goal is to hinder the producers that promote the illegal deforestation of the Amazon. We have a forum representing 30 banks where we discuss all these themes. Although the bank system have been working sustainably, we still recognize that we have a lot to do. We are following closely all these discussions. We are supporting the associated banks in the application of the recommendations and best practices. We care for the ethical behavior in the protection of the environment, and the return of the economy must be sustainable after the crisis. And I'd like to mention the work of the banks during the pandemics. They were part of the solution and not part of the problem. And I believe this will be the way the banks will work also in the environmental aspect. We will direct resources for activities that contribute to this sustainable development. With these words, I'd like to greet all participants of this webinar and those who are watching us. And FEBRABAN is very happy to be side by side with the BIS and the Central Bank. Thank you. Thank you, Isaac, for your words. Now, I'd like to invite Fernanda Nechio. Since July 2019, she is the Director of International Affairs and Corporate Risk Management of Central Bank of Brazil. She started his career in July 2009 at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. She has a master's degree and PhD by the Princeton University and several articles published in the major academic journals. Fernanda, good morning. You have the floor. Just one moment, please. Can you hear me?
Perfeito, Fernanda, está ao vivo. Muito bom dia.
Good morning, Fernanda. You are live. Oh, good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to participate in this event today. In the brief initial comments, I will focus on three major points: the responsibility of the Central Bank of Brazil facing the structural changes, the climate and social environmental risks, and the sustainability dimension of the agenda. As for the first point, the Central Bank of Brazil has as objective to ensure the security of prices, and the Central Bank needs to be on the frontier of its actions, responding to present and future risks, the evolution of demands of the society, and structural changes in the economy. The dimensions and actions of this agenda, of this hashtag, has these characteristics. The PIX and open banking are answers to the technological changes, means of payment, demands of society, looking for a more agile and safer system, and how to fit the climate agenda. The new sustainability is to create the set of structural changes in the economy. The dimension responds to the new risks and demands of the society. Climate events, considered rare, are now more frequent, and they come with several economic changes and bringing risks to the financial system. Climate risks, fire, floods, extreme temperatures, They affect the relative prices on the economy and have an impact on our decisions of the monetary policy. This can change the demand for currency, collateral damages, and high financial risks. So, to meet the targets of the central bank and guarantee the solidity, we need to be prepared and respond to structural changes in the economy. The policies of the central bank should consider the impact of extreme events in our economy. In September, we launched the new dimension of our institutional agenda. So this brings a set of measures and responsibilities, social, environmental, directed to the financial system and the central bank. The agenda of the central bank is dynamic, encompassing, involving all areas of the bank. A set of measures that we announced is encompassing but is not exhaustive. We will continue to develop as we do with the other pillars of this hashtag. Today, I can go into more details of the measures announced and our intentions. Finally, it's important to mention that the actions of the central bank to mitigate social environmental risks is in full development, both in Brazil and in the world. And the challenges to the financial system brought by the climate changes require a global action. And the dialogue with the other financial institutions, as we are doing today, are very important to determine the evolution of our actions and minimize the climate risks in our economy. This will bring better experiences, practice, and enrich our point of view of the risks associated to climate changes. Events like today's will deepen this integrated action and the response to the new challenge we need to face. Thank you. Fernanda, thank you for your words to close the opening session. I'd like to invite Mr. Luiz Pereira da Silva, Deputy General Manager of the BIS since October 2015. Before joining BIS, he was Director of Economic Policies and International Affairs of the Central Bank of Brazil. He was also the Chief Economist of the Ministry of Planning, Budget, and Officer of International Affairs. Luiz, good morning. Thank you, Amaury. It's a great pleasure to be here in this panel with Fernanda, Denise, Isaac, and Murilo. It's a great pleasure to BIS to participate in an event that shows the importance of this subject and the place it is holding in the Brazilian agenda. To my introduction, I'd like to make a brief presentation with a few slides. Is it possible to see the slides? Yes. Okay. In the beginning of the year, we created the terminology of the green swan to characterize these climate changes. But green swans, because they are rare and extreme events, that with this climate change is almost certain to manifest. But now we are in a moment that we need to alert and for this risk, as Fernanda Isaac said, but also be optimistic and talk about the growth opportunities, the new technologies used to fight the climate change can bring us. An important point is the tradition of cooperation between the financial sector and the sector in a sustainability agenda. It's a cooperation based in the introduction of innovative rules and norms since the Green Protocol in 1995, rules for accessing rural credit, the socio-environmental responsibility policy. Things that were introduced were voluntary by FEBRABAN as its socio-environmental risk policy and its guidelines on green bond. And the central bank, Fernanda mentioned, has now a new dimension in its sustainability agenda, showing the dynamic of this agenda to promote the sustainable development, the sustainable finance, and also the development of a national financial system with climate sustainability. And as she mentioned, the incorporation of sustainability variables in the decision-making process of the monetary authority. This shows that it's really an important subject that we need to address not only here in Brazil, and I bring here a more global view, which is the view of the BIS. Sustainability and productivity are not mutually exclusive. We see great financing opportunities for a green recovery for the COVID crisis that allows us to move from an agenda that was just to call the attention of the international financial community about the environmental risk and to start to show that we do have possibilities to use this fight against climate change to leverage new investments and increase productivity and resilience of our economies. For instance, sustainable and innovative practices can bring a great reduction of products of waste that produces waste. So you can improve the efficiency of our operations and improve productivity and reduce costs. Sure, we'll have initial costs because new technologies must be acquired, but regardless of the initial costs, we have a high long-term profitability. This is something that the sustainability agenda of the central bank contemplates, is the increase in sustainability and human capital with the training and attraction of new talents for technological innovation. So, in my opinion, and this is well debated in the international sphere, the financing of this transition from a lower carbon economy is fundamental for the green recovery. Why? Because it's through financing, mitigation, and adaptation strategies that will be able to increase the possibility of having an expansionary recovery from COVID. this financing, they occur in several ways, through bank credit, the capital market of each country, but also between countries in the international sphere. We need to contemplate these transfers from richer countries to poorer countries. And the macroeconomic international environment, as we know, is a favorable environment because we are still living and we will live for some time an environment of lower interest rates that provide some possibilities to some countries and a greater or larger fiscal space to finance this. And in 2017, thinking on this, the central banks created this network for the international financial system to be greener, NGFS. How this financing can be done and help the transition in several ways. For instance, today we have an effort of fiscal and monetary stimuli that is already producing effects with the expand of investments in new technologies, research and development, infrastructure, also better or higher coordination between stakeholders. The private sector today is willing to invest much more in green financial products, even through improving the taxonomy and following the ESG criteria, and we have the participation of the public and private sector and international institutions in new partnerships to develop more technologies of renewable energy, technologies that can capture the greenhouse's effect. This is done in a context where consumers, they are much more active in climate change and demands of financing to this solution. Why the transition with the low carbon economy, even with the COVID crisis, is important? Since the COVID is very serious, the recovery of the product, well, this is a way of showing the importance of a greener recovery. The idea is that a greener recovery is dominated by a recovery with greater awareness in opposition of the browner recovery shown in this yellow arrow, because it needs to be rapid and cannot concern with additional elements that should be contemplated by a green recovery. But since we are in a very serious crisis, maybe it's better to think in the speed of this recovery, even if we hinder the content, the carbon content. But this is not the only opportunity. Here you see the opportunity of what was mentioned by Isaac and Fernanda, the fact of having a mitigation and adaptation strategy, new financing of new technologies. It's possible to think about a recovery trajectory that is more robust using these new technologies And this would be the first image of a greater or a greener recovery thanks to this financing, and this would lead us to a higher situation and better situation than this brown recovery. So to conclude, I think that when we look to the climate change issues, as Fernanda mentioned, we need global solutions and coordinated among agents. These solutions require funding. They contemplate demand and supply, and this requires solutions from the banking system, and this must be materialized through new technologies. These things must have a more immediate effect, because we run a serious risk if we don't fight the climate change. For many time we thought this would be impossible, but the increase of severe events, climate events, is raising the awareness of the public. And in terms of risk methodologies, we need to improve the way we conceive the systemic risk. We need to improve the quality of the information to the consumer, including incentives, so he or she will have a more responsible attitude in terms of the carbon footprint. And on the supply side, we need to propose new technologies, new financing, so we can diversify and grow more rapidly and with a lower carbon footprint. And at last, what Isaac mentioned, there are distributive consequences in the climate change that affect, in general, poorer countries and more vulnerable segments of the society. So this must contemplate this dimension of distribution, and the growth must be new, greener, and more inclusive. Thank you. Thank you, Luiz, for your words, and I think Isaac and Fernanda's participation in the opening of this event. Before the presentations, I'd like to inform that you can ask questions to the speakers through the comment box on the NUMI's website. After the presentations, we will save 10 minutes for the Q&A session. So now I'd like to invite Fernanda Nechio again, and she will talk about the sustainability dimension of the central bank's agenda and other regular initiatives of the Brazilian Central Bank. I'd like to share my slides. Can you see them? Okay. The Central Bank of Brazil was almost a pioneer in this sustainability agenda of the financial market. I start with this first slide in showing the timeline of some examples of the central bank and also some examples of the Brazilian financial market in this sustainable sphere. A disclaimer here is that this list is not exhaustive. These are just some examples to show the action that the central bank has in this point. You see that from 2012 to 2019, several guidelines were issued to contribute with more sustainable system. We see this in the rural credit, protection of biomes, carbon reduction, and risks, not only climate, but also social, environmental. we see the need of environmental regulation to finance the agribusiness, rural credit for corporations and individuals, eliminating slavery work. And one of the examples we have here in this timeline, in 2014, we established the regulatory framework with social environmental responsibility for financial institutions. And this was globally or internationally recognized. So this is to show how we are pioneer in sustainable policies. In 2017, in a more encompassing regulatory sphere, we had a resolution on risk management. The financial institutions are responsible for identified, monitor, report, and minimize this risk management. So, the social environmental risk must be included in the scope of the risks of the integrated risk management of the financial institutions. Over these years, the central bank are inspecting the implementation of these rules and regulations, following the unfolding of the strategies, routines, and procedures of the institutions. And we also had carried some stress tests. Our pioneer position was highlighted in international forums, and I'm not going into detail. I'm not going to the part below the timeline, but it's important to show the activity of the financial market along all these years. FEBRABAN created a protocol on social environmental responsibility, and the national financial system over this years is trying to establish this agenda focusing on sustainability. It's important to have this partnership. This partnership is part of the effort of the national financial system to implement and promote a more sustainable financial system. And continuing with this pioneer, we have this hashtag agenda. The BC hashtag agenda is an institutional agenda to promote financial inclusion, competitiveness, transparency, and financial education. We always talk about these several pillars and how we promote these pillars. PIX is a big event, open banking as well, the transparency in our communication. So I'd say that in spite of the crisis that we are going through, we have never left behind the implementation of our plan related to our strategic agenda. Just the opposite. Because of the crisis, we thought it was important to accelerate and intensify the work of the strategic agenda. And we included a new pillar, sustainability, to promote sustainable risk management actions. So it was very important to consolidate the efforts we have already done and build a set of new measures involving all areas of the Brazil's central bank and promote this pioneer position in climate changes. And why the central bank included this pillar? Why sustainability is also a subject in the central bank? I've mentioned this before, But it's important to remember that the Central Bank of Brazil, as other central banks in the world, has as an objective to ensure the price stability and financial stability. For that, the central bank needs to establish a frontier, as I mentioned, climate changes, extreme temperatures affect the relative prices and our decision-making for monetary policy. Likewise, extreme events put the national financial system at stake. So, these aspects of climate change and social environmental risks affect or cause structural changes in the economy and make the Central Bank of Brazil and around the world look to these risks and take them into consideration both for their monetary policies decision and actions that will ensure the sustainability of the national financial system. So basically, it's part of the central bank's objectives, ensure the efficiency of the financial system. And for this, we need to take into account the structural changes in the economy. This is my last slide, and this is a list of the measures of this BC hashtag sustainability. I will touch briefly because we have other speakers today, but we can look to this agenda as measures focusing with focus inside the central bank and in the national financial system. So, inside the central bank and outside the central bank shows that we want to move this agenda towards a more sustainable national financial system, but also we want to lead this transition being the example. Everything that we are going to announce that applies to the national financial system will also be implemented internally. So, starting with the internal measure directed to the central bank, we want to foster the culture of sustainability in the institution. We are reviewing our social environmental responsibility policy, identifying areas for development, and incorporating the actions foreseen in the sustainability agenda. This internal agenda, focusing on the internal social environmental development, involves all areas of the central bank. It's a joint effort. Our intention is to improve and expand the communication and dialogue with the society. The Central Bank of Brazil is committed to implement the task force, the TCFD. It was created to meet a demand. It's a set of recommendations for financial and non-financial institutions to disclose information of climate impacts of their business. We are supporting these recommendations and we are going to adopt the TCFD recommendations internally. This shows the transparency of our actions on climate change actions in Brazil. And the financial institutions will also implement the TCFD recommendations within the scope of regulatory measures that we announced with our sustainability pillar. Now, about the risk management within the central bank, we created an integrated policy since 2011, recognized nationally and internationally. This integrated policy comprehends an analysis of several sources of risk and the measures to manage the risk and support the decision-making process. Our intention is to improve this approach, the integrated management risk, and this means that these socio-environmental risks and climate risks will be discussed regularly in all instances of decisions before the decision is implemented by the Central Bank of Brazil. In addition, and this is very important for the Central Bank and the financial institutions, it's essential to have more transparency in our accountability with the society and the results we are obtaining with these measures. So we will publish annually the annual report of risk, socio-environmental and climate risks, describing our agenda and the new measures that we elaborate. As I mentioned in my initial comments, this is an agenda that is still under development. It's through the central banks and the financial institutions. So this discussion that we have here and in the international forums will provide us the guidelines of how going forward with this agenda. We have very well-defined timeline for all measures implemented. These terms are the limits of implementation. It doesn't mean that we cannot accelerate the implementation of the limits, but we have a time limit to implement, and all measures announced will be in effect. And this term or timeline gives this financial system a time to prepare themselves to implement the measures. So the other actions and measures listed in this summary, as I said, the central bank and the financial system actions is a subject being discussed. So partnerships with international institutions are crucial, and also to keep the discussion and in the sphere of sustainable policies. So the inclusion of the Central Bank of Brazil in the NGFS was our first action towards sustainability. This agency was created in 2017 to discuss and elaborate the best practices to run the financial system facing the challenges imposed by climate changes. And also, we are talking with CBI. CBI is an institution directed to the issue of green bonds, and this partnership will help us for the development of the measures we announced in September. We have other partnerships. We have JZ partnership with the German agency that helps the central bank to develop projects in the area of sustainable finance, and we will continue this continuous dialogue with other central banks and international forums to be at the frontier of the sustainable finance. In the sustainability agenda, we are developing a financial line for liquidity. This line would be a systemic instrument for liquidity And as I mentioned, highlighting the social environmental risk, we are developing the necessary analysis to include social environmental criteria also in the management or international reserves. So these two measures related to liquidity and inclusion of sustainable criteria are very new measures, very innovative, and we are in the process of developing internal studies to establish the implementation of these measures. Now, going to supervision and regulation, we are improving the information collection about social environmental risks. And we are also improving the stress tests related to climate and social environmental risks. This is an area that benefits from the international agreements. So in the area of supervision, the central bank is committed to improve our actions and ensure the compliance with the regulations. And finally, the regulation area, we have a set of very interesting measures. The recommendations of the TCFD would be expanded, and criteria that identify operations with sustainable characteristics. The importance of this measure is related to the obstacles to develop sustainable actions, the cost related to sustainable finance and actions considered sustainable. With this Green Bureau and the information about sustainable measures and green actions by the national financial system, we will be making the access to information cheaper, and also the establishment of incentives for sustainable actions. This is a measure that has a very good potential. We also announced that we'll improve the limits for the rural credit with green actions. Well, we see this sustainable agenda of the central bank as dynamic, encompassing, including all the areas of the bank, but it is not exhaustive. Our sustainability dimension will continue to evolve over time and will be very good for this type of interaction we have here. Thank you, Fernanda, for your presentation. This sustainability gains a great reinforcement with this new pillar. Now, I'd like to invite Murilo Portugal. He has been the president of FEBRABAN for 3 consecutive terms, and he was also member of the board of Banco do Brasil and Caixa and member of the board at Eletrobras. In the public sector, he was advisor of the cabinet and head of the economic advisory, and as secretary of the National Treasury, he participated in the implementation of the Rio Plan of Economic Stabilization. In international organization, he was the executive director of the World Bank and executive director and deputy general director of the IMF.
Mais uns minutinhos, Murilo já estará conosco.
Well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for those
Bom dia a
who
todos.
are already in the afternoon in other parts of the world. I'm speaking in English because this seminar is designed mainly to address a foreign audience, but information and translation is in Portuguese is available. I wish to, first of all, thank the Central Bank of Brazil, the BIS, and the FEBRABAN for the invitation to speak on this web seminar on the banking sector efforts to speed up the transition to a greener economy. What I plan to do is to give some general background information on Brazil's current position in this transition, given that this information may not be known by our foreign colleagues, to talk about some voluntary initiatives that the Brazilian banking sector has been undertaken, and then to finish up with some personal observations on the challenges that we all face. I think that overall, Brazil stands on a good position for the transition to a greener economy. Currently, 46% of the country's energy matrix is already made up by renewable energy compared to 14% average worldwide. And the situation is even more favorable in electricity production, where 83% is already from renewable sources compared to an average of 22% worldwide and 26% average in the OECD countries. Being a large and a populous country, Brazil ranks 7th in terms of greenhouse emissions, accounting for 3.4% of global emissions, which is nearly 7 times less the contribution of China, 3 times less the contribution of the US, and 2 times less the contribution of the European Union. Some 61.5% of our country's territory is covered with natural forests, and another 6.2% is covered by non-forest natural formations. And this means that 70%, nearly 70% of the Brazilian territory still has the same type of vegetation cover that it had in the 1500s when the Portuguese arrived here. And agriculture and cattle raising utilize just 28% of the total area, and is done mainly in the center-west region, the southeast region, and the southern region of Brazil. We do have an issue with illegal deforestation in the Amazon. Deforestation had been declining there since 2004, when it had reached 25,000 square kilometers, and this trend persisted until 2012, when 4.5 thousand square kilometers were devastated, and since 2013, deforestation numbers in the Amazon has been growing again. Brazil has a long-standing and wide-encompassing legal and regulatory environmental protection framework. Central Bank Deputy Governor Fernanda Nechio talked about the regulatory framework. I'm talking here about the legal framework. These are laws that have been passed in Parliament. And I would like to point just to 3 things. First, that our main environmental law, which dates from 1981, has very wide provisions defining legal and financial responsibilities for pollution and for environmental damage. A law on environmental crimes has been enacted, establishing prison sentences for these definitions of environmental crimes. And in 2012, a new forestry code was issued, and amongst the provisions that it has, it established a natural rural environmental registry, which requires that all farms and rural properties in Brazil are registered there. And according to the Brazilian legislation, any farm or rural property in Brazil has to preserve a certain area of its size. This is called the legal reserve, and it varies from a minimum of 20% of the property in areas of old settlement, like here in the state of São Paulo, to 80% of the property in the Amazon region. And FEBRABAN, on behalf of the banks, has funded in 2014 an initiative to use satellite images to draw georeferenced maps for 4,000 out of the 5,570 Brazilian municipalities. And these maps shows the areas that can be put to economic use, the areas that need to be protected, and those who should have been protected and were not protected, and therefore require reforestation at the owner's own expense. This slide I'll jump because Deputy Governor Fernanda Nechio has already talked. In terms of voluntary undertakings, a number of things have been done, starting in 1995, when state-owned banks signed a green protocol pledging to adopt the environmental practices that was later followed by the private-owned banks. In 2003, the Brazilian Stock Exchange, B3, issued a business sustainability index, which is composed solely with stock of companies that adopt environmental criteria. And FEBRABAN also has issued a self-regulation on sustainability in 2013. A point that I would like to emphasize is that the banking sector attitude to environmental issues have been changing all over this period. Initially, it was a passive do no harm approach, the aim of which was merely to comply with environmental regulations in order to avoid liabilities. But more recently, we moved from this do no harm approach to a doing good attitude, aiming to not only comply with regulations, but to increase finance to the green economy. So since 2013, FEBRABAN started to measure the proportion of total corporate bank lending that is extended to activities that are considered to be part of the green economy. To do that, a taxonomy of what constitutes the green economy was created, taking the activities that are defined as green by the United Nations Environmental Programme and translating these activities into the Brazilian government classification of economic activities, which is widely used by all companies for tax purposes. And since then, using this taxonomy, 15 banks, which account for 87% of total corporate bank lending in Brazil, started to collect and to report to FEBRABAN information on corporate loans extended to these activities. And as Isaac said in his presentation, in 2019, FEBRABAN started a partnership with the central bank to improve and to expand this methodology. FEBRABAN is now having access directly to the credit information that is collected by the central bank. So this has permitted to expand this to the entire banking sector. The results shows that there is a good start, but at the same time, there is still a lot to be done in terms of transition to a greener economy. Between 2013 and 2018, an annual average of around 18% of all corporate lending went into finance the green economy. This has increased to 22% in 2019, while 53% of corporate bank lending is to sectors that are exposed to climate change risk. I think this is a very important initiative, because what is not measured is not properly managed. And I believe this to be a pioneer initiative worldwide. FEBRABAN also finances a series of studies to examine opportunities as well as obstacles to expand green financing and to manage environmental risks. In partnership with the Brazilian Business Council for Sustainable Development, CBEDS, FEBRABAN has prepared a guide on how to issue green bonds. It has funded a study on the opportunities and challenges to finance the expansion of solar energy in Brazil, which is a source of energy that has been growing very rapidly in Brazil. Another very interesting study is an analysis of the bankability of projects for forest reforestations by farms that did not comply with the legal reserve rule, which, as I said, requires that between 20 and 80% of the rural property is protected. So this study was done with a sample of rural properties in the states of São Paulo, Mato Grosso, and Paraná, and looking both at small properties, medium-term properties, and larger properties that produce soybean, sugarcane, and cattle raising. And it found that these properties, in some cases, could finance out of their own revenues these projects of forest restoration, and therefore they are bankable projects. All these reports are available at the FEBRABAN website. Another thing that is being done by FEBRABAN is to speed up and to expand its training programs, including the issue of social and environmental sustainability in the program of the FEBRABAN Education Institute. So FEBRABAN has been running annual courses on sustainability concepts, on environmental risks and opportunities, on the impact of climate change on business, on how to manage deforestation risk. And last year, there were 160 bank staff that were trained on this. I would like to finish now with some personal remarks based on my experience in dealing with environmental issues, initially in the World Bank and then the IMF, and lately in FEBRABAN. And I think there is no doubt that Brazil and the Brazilian banks are fully committed and fully engaged in the global fight against the climate change. But we know that being financial intermediaries, there are limits to what banks and, in fact, any other private enterprise can do alone, because private enterprises have to be guided in the end by price signals and by their customers' preferences. So the final solution to this issue of climate change challenge is to come from changes in the preferences and behaviors of consumers and investors. And these changes have to be aided by technological innovation that offer viable new alternatives for clean energy to be used in production, in transportation, in services, which is something that is already happening with the use of public funds to finance technological innovation and research, and with subsidies to expand the production of clean energy. And as a result of that, there is a sizable cost reduction in solar energy, in wind energy, larger and more efficient batteries that can store energy have been produced, dealing with the problem of the intermittency of these other forms of energy. The production of electric cars is already a reality. So all these technological innovations will facilitate the changes in consumer behavior, which in the end is what is going to drive this shift towards the greener economy. But we all know that both technological advances and changes in consumer habits can and must be nudged by appropriate pricing to reflect negative or positive externalities. So to my mind, the solution to this problem lies on technological innovation, on changes in consumer preferences, on more strict environmental regulation, and on appropriate pricing of carbon, which in my view is the piece of this puzzle on which we have done the least progress of all. I think since the global financial crisis and now with the coronavirus pandemic, fiscal authorities are becoming ever more accustomed to rely on central banks and financial markets to help them to do their fiscal jobs. And I think there is one I would like to finish calling up attention to the last World Economic Bank issued by the IMF, which has a very interesting chapter 3, dealing with this issue of climate change and how to speed up the transition to climate change. And there, the IMF calls for a combination of 3 types of policy tools. First would be a program of subsidies and investments to increase the supply of green energy. This would start with 1% of global GDP and would decline gradually to 0 in 10 years' time. The second component would be carbon prices calibrated to achieve an 80% reduction of emissions by 2050, and this would be achieved through global taxation of carbon, gradually increasing carbon prices at a rate of 7% per year, and starting from $6 to $20 a ton of carbon, depending on country, and increasing. And the third component, which has also been made here, is compensatory transfers, because we know that these shifts and these changing prices would affect mainly and mostly poor households. So the third component of this program is to transfer 25% of the carbon taxes revenues to the poorest in each country to protect their purchasing power. So I think it is a large program. It's a serious problem. It's a global problem, which, as Luiz said, has uncertain. We know that risks will materialize. We don't know when. It's like the coronavirus risk, which some might think is a low probability, but have a very high impact. And to solve this issue, I think it's an important priority to everyone. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, Murilo, pela sua apresentação.
For your
São
presentation.
iniciativas importantes.
These are important initiatives developed in a voluntary manner by Brazil and in joint actions with the Central Bank of Brazil. Now I invite Denise Pavarina. She is Associate Consultant of Agrego, Vice Chair of the TCFD, member of the Merger and Acquisitions Committee and Women Corporate Directors Foundation, with more than 30 years of experience in the financial and capital markets. She was the corporate director of the BNDES. Denise was also president of Ambima and member of a board of several companies, Vale, B3, Cielo, Arcelor Brasil, Alpargatas e Latasa. Denise?
Prazer muito grande, queria agradecer a FEBRABAN, o Isaac.
I'd like to thank FEBRABAN, Isaac, and Mauri for this invitation. It's a great pleasure.
Momento muito feliz, muito bom ver todas as ações que estão sendo tomadas.
We are in a very good moment seeing that all these actions being taken. When we started with the task force, we did a reading of all the countries who were participating of this process, and we've seen the central bank with several actions corroborating what Fernanda said. This, the Central Bank of Brazil was really ahead of many of banks. I want to share my screen with you. Can you see it?
Não, ainda não.
Não?
No, not yet.
Desculpa, vou voltar então.
I'm sorry.
Pronto agora.
Agora sim.
Tá
Pronto, Denise.
Okay.
Ok, obrigada.
Thank you.
Bom, só vou passar rapidamente.
Very briefly, I know that many of you know it already, but I will go briefly on the task force. It was created in 2016 from a request of the Financial Stability Board, and I'm honored to be here in this event with these colleagues. And when the origin of this task force was assessing, according to the Paris Agreement, the transition risks we would have in a low transmission economy and the risks of natural catastrophes that could cause chronic events that we have experienced in several places, including here. This was the spirit and the Financial Stability Board, and I'd like to congratulate all the regulators for following this movement. Since it's a new movement, everybody is learning, and asked the private market to make recommendations of the financial risks associated to climate risks. The intention was to promote more informed decisions for banks, insurance companies, issuers, investors, the entire financial system. And in turn, the companies would be able to get prepared, including in their strategic discussions, because in some sectors this is a very relevant risk. And then a very representative geographic group with experts in several sectors with two purposes. Luiz mentioned this, but the task force is not only looking to challenge the risks, the task risks, and the physical risks, and the transition risks. Now the regulators are starting to place some rules in terms of replacing technology, market risks and reputational risk. But we also have several other opportunities where the financial and capital market can act on, which is the replacement for more efficiency energy, the better use of water, and the resilience of the companies facing this scenario of climate change and risks. The recommendations based in 4 pillars, starting with governance, because it is important to have it from the board permeating the entire institution. Also, a strategy. I will mention a survey that we did, risk management, that for the financial sector is quite natural. We know that the life of the banks is to have a good risk management, is nothing new. But for mid-sized companies is a novelty. We've seen great difficulties for these companies in the risk management area. Metrics and targets maybe is the less developed point in the good sense, because we have several initiatives in process, but we need to standardize. Otherwise, we will not be able to compare. So, in spite of having many measures and measurement systems being developed, now we are getting into a phase of finding the common points. And we create some guides to several sectors with generic recommendations, and other that would be more specific to some sectors. And we divide the sectors in financial and non-financial due to the relevance of the environmental impact and climate change. The financial sector has 4 activities: banks, insurance companies, managers, and what we call asset owners, which is the private equities and pension funds that carry the positions for long term, almost as the original owner of the company. So it should have a deeper look compared to the company in our understanding. In the non-financial groups, we have energy, transportation, materials and construction, agriculture, food and forest products. Always looking the principle of materiality, because it needs to be material, scenario analysis, which is also relevant for this purpose, and the recommendation is that the organizations do this in an integrated way, in the risk matrix integrated with all the other data that the company discloses in the statement. Right now, what are we doing in this task force? By the end of October, beginning of November, we will have the first status report of this task force. We have this commitment with the FIB to do this, and we are also publishing some papers in some segments. We saw that there was a need for this guide. So this we'll have for scenario analysis, and we'll have also a public consultation, a way of measuring and identify the assets that should be reduced or implemented, and talking about the survey process. And we use artificial intelligence, the financial statements as published by the companies. We see compliance with the recommendations, but they are not enough. And we need an additional effort, and this is what we are trying to do, because in the part of the strategy, we still see some resistance in the disclosure of information showing the capacity of that company to support or really change business locations. That we know that we have companies that rely on the place they are, especially agriculture. So it's natural to know that the agricultural sector depends on the local conditions, but not only them, and others as the renewable energy sector. We still see some a principle that would take 5 years will take more. And here, a timeline with several actions. We don't have 2020, but we have 1,515 companies that support not only central banks and stock exchange, supporting the task force to help in this implementation. And Michael Bloomberg is our chairman, and representatives of several sectors and the members of the task force, who are many. Now, talking about Brazil, the interest for sustainable finance is increasing in the world and in Brazil. I said it's a showtime for the regulators because we see many movements happening in this need to create standards as possible, and also taking into consideration the cases, because different sectors have different realities. But we see several movements. Murilo mentioned this taxonomy. Europe has a huge movement now, hoping that in 2022, based on the results of 2021, including asset managers, need to explain, classify why they call their funds of ESG to avoid movements like greenwashing. Those that call themselves green but not sustainable, and how to show this, demonstrate this, to have this relevant and serious movement, not to lose their importance. We also had a publication of the IFRS Foundation, a public consultation, to publish the standards of the global sustainability standards. We know we had an event with the CVM that is working with IOSCO to create these standards. We have a debate, many papers, and many ways of doing this. They are working on this. And our best news was the sustainable agenda of the central bank and the support to the task force. This is very important. And thinking about the market, This is a moment that we see investors starting to have an interest. The banks are well advanced with several initiatives, and they are the ones who have this capacity, because when they start to establish standards, they create an effect on the productive chain, not only in the bank. The bank is a conduit to reach the smallest company in the productive chain and to make it start to think strategically and then in terms of reporting. So, until now, since 2015, which was the first green emission in Brazil, we have almost $15 billion issued and 45 emissions classified as green. And if we call sustainable, it is 61. But now we are 45. We have data on these issues. In this 61, we include lending, and the CV is designing a FIDIC, environmental and sustainable FIDIC. And we have an association of managers, Net Zero Asset Alliance, and they are institutional investors committed to zero their GHG emissions by 2050. They want to change the portfolio without compromising the capacity of funding the company. We need to be this, like this. We need to help the companies to go through this transition. And of course, technology must come together, because not all companies will have technology at the zero moment to make this full transition. So we need to have a horizon, and 2050 it's okay. And the demand is for clean energy, sustainable agribusiness, and to reduce the use of clean water, to increase the water of reuse, because it is a limited resource. We had companies that in a very difficult moment and volatility were able to have captures, important capture like Natura and Suzano. And this green drive and sustainable drive helped. It's a movement, a natural movement that we are seeing in the market. Other companies will also be able to capture it, but when the resource was scarce or the complex, the one who have this sustainable drive or green drive will be more successful. We see managers much more concerned and engaged to develop products with this sustainable orientation. So on one hand, we have those that use the best-in-class filters, but we have other possible filters, and everyone is finding its own way to do this management. But they are not many. We see this happening recently. And there is a very interesting fund that had the participation of local and international markets, which is the creation of a fund for the integration of agribusiness and cattle breeding and forest. It's $60 billion. It will be managed by FIDIC, and we have several players, Bradesco, João Guiço, SP Singenta, Embrapa. So we see some concrete movement towards green finance. We see opportunity to funding. Agrego has been contacted to help companies to find bonds and securities issued with this direction. So we need to be concerned with the interest rate. It's good because it's open space for other markets, other companies in different products to be brought to the market. But if we think about this sustainability moment, we can have differentiated prices for green bonds in relation to a traditional emission or issue that will not be directed to one of these targets that we mentioned. So two subjects that are important. On one hand, the investors, they have a very short-term view. This is historical in Brazil, and we hope that this level of interest rate is kept because it makes viable investments in infrastructure and brings what we tried, the financial education, people not being restricted on one single bond, so to learn to diversify and look more to other investments that are slightly risky. And another subject are the pension funds. They play an important role. This group, Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, with institutional investors committed to reduce or zero the emissions. And they have this important role, this fomenter role, because the investors can, in a responsible way, make their investments, and they're doing important movements to improve their investment capacity, but they need support. They play a role in the financial economy much more relevant than what they are able to do now. So we should carefully look to what they can do because they have a great responsibility, but these investments are normally made by large investments who can carry long-term investments, and the funds, since they are open funds, they have another dynamics. So we need to look for those who can carry in the long run and can motivate the company to go into this direction. So very soon we will have more news about the task force. Oh, another detail. We have a study from price that shows the growth of the ESG funds, and according to their estimates in 2025, 60% of the mutual funds will be ESG because the society will demand it from us. So we'll have news soon. We'll have a public consultation, and we
possa ajudar também nessa questão das métricas, porque a gente precisa de uma padronização.
We need a standard. Our companies are internationally listed, so international investors come to Brazil, so we need a comparable situation. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Denise. And FEBRABAN, together with the associate banks, we prepared a roadmap to implement the TCP recommendations. Well, we are late, but we have some questions to our speakers. I will reduce some questions. I stop. Fernanda, you are being demanded here. Well, I will select two questions. Fernanda. Questions from Wellington Labs. If the central bank expects that the financial institutions include the climate risks in their stress tests, if you are going to use the NGFS scenarios, or you are going to develop specific scenarios to Brazil, and if you expect that the banks adopt comply with the Paris Agreement. Thank you, Mauricio, for your questions and of our audience, and for the opportunity to answer. We have already stress tests being carried relating to climate risks, and will be improving this instrument in the coming month. The banks must take into consideration climate and social environmental risks and programs of risk mitigation in their risk management programs. So this is a development, and we are improving. One of the good points of getting into NGFS is to know the scenarios and how to build scenarios of instructions. So I think this is something we'll be using the existing scenarios and the recommendations to build these scenarios. But one important factor is that many times these scenarios must be adapted to our situation. Suppose a snowstorm that will never come to Brazil, so we need to know how to adapt and implement to each country. That's why recommendations are recommendations and not rules, because they need to be adapted to the reality of every jurisdiction. So this is very important. And as TCFD, we are working with the financial system in the self-regulation and implementation of the regulations, and what we announced in our agenda in September is that this will be a requirement for the banks to implement the recommendations. I hope I have answered all the questions. Oh, just one comment. I'm sorry. On Denise's presentation, that was very interesting. She mentioned financial education, diversifying assets, and this is also what we have in this agenda, because everybody is the pillar, sustainability, talks with the financial education pillar and inclusion pillar. So you can find this in all the pillars, this interaction between financial education, sustainability, and financial inclusion is very important for the green agenda. Thank you, Fernanda. The next question is for Murilo and Denise. Murilo brought this question from the bank sense. A series of initiatives are being implemented by the Brazilian bank sector, and it's always a challenge to escalate the reach and the impact. Can you mention an example of what is happening in the Brazilian scenario, the challenge of escalate the reach?
Well, I'm going to
Bom,
continue in English.
eu vou continuar em inglês.
Change language in the middle. I think scaling up is always a challenge, but this is being done in Brazil. We have seen the statistics that I've just shown in terms of bank lending, for instance. There is already a sizable amount of bank lending to sectors that compose the green economy, more than 20% of total corporate bank lending. This is an example. Of course, it can and it should expand, but as I said, we need to measure to know where we are and where we want to go. Denise mentioned another example, which is the issuance of green bonds, more than $15 billion already in Brazil. But markets are huge, and the opportunities are also huge. These are small amounts still. I think the ways to increase that is to have, of course, it varies from sector to sector, but always to have good regulation, which in our case we do have, better and more information, and in some cases, better legal certainty, which is a problem in Brazil, the question of legal certainties, of laws being applied quickly, and as they have been written by the legislator. But my experience is that the opportunities to increase are huge. And as I said, I'm a believer in the price system to guide the decisions by everyone, consumers and producers. So I think more needs to be done in terms of pricing in this area.
Obrigado, Murilo. Agora eu passo para a Denise.
Bom, eu acredito que a gente realmente começou um movimento, a escala virá por conta desse movimento
scale will come because of this movement, and I will repeat, interest rates. I always ask when the capital market will happen, when the interest rate is low, because people will look for options. If the interest rate is high, there is nothing to do. And now we see managers
para poder atender a demanda dos clientes e naturalmente, esse componente de sustentabilidade, esse componente verde, ele entra assim no momento perfeito para poder criar outras classes de ativos que vão atender os investidores. A gente teve o marco de saneamento, nós temos algumas já concessões acontecendo. É um setor que vai requerer muito investimento, vai ter muita oportunidade.
It's a sector that
ele encaixa
of investment and it fits perfectly in this sustainability issue. It's fundamental for education, and we have good opportunities with this demand for different assets demand. Murilo is right. Price is the king, and people look for alternatives. Having this opportunity, the managers will go towards this direction. The banks, as I mentioned, they are very relevant in terms of the economy structure. They are inducers, they are disseminators, and we know that when we had the problems of PLD, the role that banks exerted, and now with sustainability, so undoubtedly this movement is on already. Thank you, Denise. We are going towards our closing, so each speaker has 1 minute for final considerations. First, I'd like to thank the opportunity to participate in this panel. It was very interesting. We are all working in an agenda towards development, and all measures that we announced in the central bank are focusing on sustainability, and they will be improved during this process. I think we have a lot to learn and share in events like this one. So once again, I thank you for the invitation, and thank you. Fernanda, now Murilo, please.
Well, I also
Bem,
would like to thank
eu também gostaria de agradecer.
in this event, which gave me an opportunity to meet some old friends and make new acquaintances and to discuss a very important issue. I think that Brazil, being a very large and a rich country in terms of natural resources, have many opportunities in this area. We are just starting. I think the energy sector is an example. We are a sunny place, and in our coastal areas, we are a windy place. So there are lots of opportunities for solar energy and for wind energy. The other area is transportation. I think Brazil is very concentrated in highways and uses on a very little scale other cheaper forms of transport like coastal and river water transport like railways. So there is a lot of money to be made on this. And the third area is urban development, where there are many opportunities in terms of retrofitting existing buildings and designing new ones, but also in terms of urban transportation, which is heavily based on private cars and with a lot of congestion, or buses, which are also very costly. So there are a lot of opportunities in urban development and transport as well. So I'm very bullish in terms of this agenda. I think it will be a big plus for our country in a moment where we need really to grow faster. We have been growing at a slow rate for the last several decades, and it's time now to speed up our growth rate. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Obrigado, Murilo.
Thank you, Murilo. Now, Denise, you have the floor. First, I'd like to thank again for the invitation. It was a great pleasure to share with my colleagues and see how we are aligned. For those who work in the capital market for many years, I can say finally, it's nice what we see. And I'd like to congratulate the organization of the event. Maybe Brazil has the greatest opportunity of leading the green movement, it's nice to insist. We have all conditions to be a major player. We have several relevant movements. We have a clean energy matrix when we compare with some of the countries which doesn't have any option, but we do. We have technology. We have fantastic institutions that develop technology for better using technology. We have a wonderful forest, so we can be a major player and attract capital, investment capital, and this will help the country. So I wish you good luck and thank you again. Thank you, Denise. It's a pity our time is over. I'd like to thank Fernanda, Murilo, Denise for their availability, and also to remind you that this webinar is part of Café com Sustentabilidade. Luiz, are you still with us? You still have 1 minute for your final comments. Well, just to illustrate that this type of event shows all the correlation of our sectors, this demonstration of the growth potential of the green agenda when faced seriously represents to the country a great opportunity. And I think the international community must be aware of these opportunities. And this is the type of a picture that we have to take to the international scenario for the sustainable growth and inclusive growth. Thank you, Luiz. Thank you for your availability and participation. So this webinar is part of Café com Sustentabilidade. This edition is available at the FEBRABAN website. And lastly, FEBRABAN, Banco Central do Brasil, the Central Bank of Brazil, and BIS, thank you for your attention. See you later. Bye-bye. Have a nice day.